a Tomahawk land attack missile. The missiles were fired at Shayrat Air Base, where it's believed the gas airstrikes were launched from. They targeted runways, hangars, ammo depots, the control tower, radio installations. This represents a pretty serious escalation for the United States, and it's the first major test of Trump's exercising military authority. So Russia has indicated it's basically not so pleased with this. They've stated so publicly. And they responded by committing an additional Navy frigate, a couple of corvettes, and support ships to bolster the fleet that's already on patrol in the Mediterranean. What is your view on all of this? What do you think the potential scenarios are here, and what are the ramifications going forward?
Well, Alex, it's a great question, and I was as fascinated by the detail you just provided, as I'm sure our listeners are. I'm a strategic analyst and a geopolitical analyst, but I don't claim to be a military expert in the sense of true expertise in all those systems. So that's a great introduction. I happen to be involved in some business development with another veteran, actually retired lieutenant colonel who the Army Ranger, a lot of experience in the Middle East, was in the wars in Afghanistan and Iraq. And after that attack, that gas attack in Syria became known, he emailed me and just said, all the threats in the world, of all the things you have to confront and ways to possibly die, he said, that is the worst. So certainly confirms your analysis that of the horrific nature of this. All these attacks in the Middle East, really around the world, are all pretty horrific. But I guess if there's a scale of horrificness, if that's a word, then this is pretty high up there. So certainly confirms what you're saying. I'd like to take a step back. The Syrian situation, I don't really see it as an escalation so much as a response, very specific, very narrowly focused response to the gas attack. Now, of course, we all know back in, I believe it was 2012, maybe 2011, but I think 2012, when there were some prior gas attacks, and there have been several, and actually going all the way back to Saddam Hussein in Iraq prior to 2003, both dictators, Saddam and Assad, have used chemical, biological weapons and gas attacks in the past. So these have been going on for a while. This certainly wasn't the first one. But President Obama drew the famous red line, said, in effect, if you use gas, there'll be a price to pay. He wasn't specific about what it was, but clearly military action was implied. Assad did use the gas, and Obama did nothing. They got into a long negotiation, et cetera. Now, I don't want to rehash that history. I think listeners are familiar with it. But the point is, this opened the door to a lot of things. It really was the beginning of the rise of ISIS. It was the beginning of a Russian intervention in Syria. Russia's always had ambitions and some access to warm water ports, but since then they've built two major ports. Of course, the significance of warm water, if you look at Russia, it's a big country with a big coastline, most of which is frozen most of the year. So the ability to get vessels in and out of Mediterranean ports is a big deal. They built an air base. They put in the Spetsnaz special forces. They get a big footprint in Syria, as does Iran. And that was it. Basically, with Obama's actions, it was the United States saying, we're checking out. We're out of here. And one of the oldest sayings, both in physics and geopolitics. In physics, its nature abhors a vacuum. Geopolitics, power abhors a vacuum. But it's the same thing, which is when you create a vacuum, whether it's physical or political, it's not like nothing happens. What happens is something else rushes in. You may leave, but something else is coming in. And once the U.S. checked out of the Middle East, it didn't mean, peace, love, and understanding in the Middle East. It meant that somebody else was going to come in, and somebody else was Russia and Iran. So now, flash forward, Assad uses the chemical weapons again, but this time he did cross the red line, and Trump struck back. Now, I guess the question is, what happens, just to kind of pick up on the escalatory dynamic, what happens if Assad uses chemical weapons again, which you can't rule out. I would expect Trump would strike again, except this time with with more force and against more targets. So I believe there were 6 air bases. He disabled 1. Well, he got 5 to go, and maybe they'll take out 2 or 3 or all 6 the next time. Basically, ground the Syrian Air Force, degrade, eliminate what's left of Syrian air power. Syrian air power is not a threat to U.S. air power. It's just a threat to its own people. But of course, that's what Trump's trying to stop. So let's see what happens. Secretary of State Rex Tillerson's in Moscow as we speak, meeting with Lavrov and Medvedev. Not clear if he's going to meet with Putin, but I'm sure there are plenty of back-channel communications going on. Whether the U.S. and Russia can come to some kind of joint arrangement on the future side, this all remains to be seen. But for now, I don't think the U.S. is going to do more. I mean, we do have boots on the ground in Syria. When people say, does this mean boots on the ground? Well, the boots are already there, but they're not in Damascus. They're not in the places we attacked. They're special forces, special operators, as they're called, working with the Syrian rebels, working with other forces, including Turks and Kurds, to defeat ISIS, and particularly in preparation for the Battle of Raqqa, which will be one of the big events of 2017. Raqqa, of course, is the capital, de facto capital of the Islamic Caliphate or the Islamic State. That's what ISIS is all about. So there's going to be a lot more fighting in Syria. U.S. is involved. We do have boots on the ground, but we're certainly not going to send a Marine Expeditionary Unit into, to liberate Damascus or take out Assad. That will be done through diplomacy. But we certainly have a very tense situation, subject to escalation. I think I think of it as a chess game. Assad made his move. Trump made his move. Now it's Assad's turn. Let's see what he does. Hopefully he got the message, and this is the end of chemical weapons, but we'll see. But what I'm focused on, Alex, is, again, Syria is critical, so I'm not diminishing the importance of that at all. But I think we have a much, much more dangerous situation in North Korea. When I look at gold and stocks and other markets, that they have many drivers. Geopolitics is one of them, plus all the normal fundamentals and supply and demand and economic things that we talk about on this podcast all the time. But sometimes geopolitics comes to the fore. It's always there in the background. But when you look at day-to-day movements, particularly in gold, you say, well, okay, we've got a couple things. We've got just physical supply and demand. We've talked about that in the past. We've got, Federal Reserve interest rate policy, because, gold famously has no yield. Of course, my answer to that is it's money. It's not supposed to have a yield. Money has no yield. If you want yield, you have to take risk, and you're in the world of investing. But when it comes to money, whether it's a dollar bill in your pocket or a gold coin, it's not supposed to have a yield because it's a medium of exchange. That said, gold does compete for investor dollars with interest-bearing investments, and as interest rates go up, it can be a headwind for gold. Not always, but it can be. So you have the monetary vector, and you've got geopolitics. You basically have 3 vectors: basic supply and demand, monetary policy, and geopolitics. They can all 3 be pointing up at the same time or down, or you can have a mixed bag. But right now, certainly geopolitics is a big driver. But in my view, the driver is North Korea more so than Syria, although Syria does have that kind of potential.
All right. Speaking of North Korea, President Trump has ordered a U.S. carrier group to steam in the direction of the Northwest Pacific in the vicinity of North Korea. The carrier group consists of the USS Carl Vinson, which is a Nimitz-class nuclear-powered aircraft carrier, a Ticonderoga-class guided missile cruiser, 2 Arleigh Burke-class guided missile destroyers, and an unknown number of submarines. North Korea's response has been a threat of nuclear attack on the United States. Not that that's anything new. They've been saying that for a long time now. And also they're warning that their nuclear capability, if we can call it that, is targeting, which is of a much greater concern, in my opinion, targeting U.S. military bases in South Korea. So Trump's comments regarding China's role in theater were that it would be better if China solved the North Korea problem themselves, and that if China decides to help, this is something he tweeted out, if China decides to help, that'd be great. But if not, that we will solve the problem without them. Now, do you see this simply as strong talk, or given the action in Syria, do you think Trump is prepared to back that up? And what does it mean for the overall Korean theater? And as a follow-on, how does this affect the rest of the world?
Yeah, I don't see. I followed it closely, Alex. I don't see any of this as just talk or just even strong talk. I think it has a real potential to spin out of control into something. Certainly, possibility of a nuclear war with Korea, and maybe something much worse. And I'll talk about that in detail. By the way, as I say, I always appreciate your. I'm not sure if all the listeners know about your own military background and expertise, and I appreciate that rundown of the elements of an aircraft carrier strike force. It's funny, Reuters, which is a great news service, they use it all the time, very reliable. They published something on this. They said, well, what's in a strike group, and what do these vessels look like, and so forth. Then those kind of infographics are very popular, very useful. But they did have the destroyer, the Arleigh Burke class destroyer, and the cruiser, and they had silhouettes. You know how they Janes and all the other military publications have silhouettes of aircraft or vessels, and they had them backwards. They had the cruiser in the destroyer column and the destroyer in the cruiser column. As you know, cruisers are a little boxier and destroyers are a little more lean and mean. They're both very potent. Anything with with cruise missiles on board is a potent vessel, but just goes to show even the experts can get it mixed up. So we certainly always glad to be the beneficiary of your expertise. But let's talk about North Korea now. The thing about wars is that most of the time they don't happen because anybody thinks it's a good idea. They happen because of strategic miscalculation. Sometimes wars are started on purpose. You know, the Islamic State, they just want to go out and kill people and start a war. So they're ones who are, I don't think they're very strategic. They're just doing whatever they can to inflame tensions and start wars. So sometimes that happens, or it's a quick land grab, et cetera. But often wars, particularly big ones, start through a series of miscalculations. And there's no better example of that than World War I. I've studied World War I very closely, and the number of times I picked up a 700 or 800 page book on World War I and got like a third of the way through and just threw it down and shook my head, couldn't finish it, or at least had to put it off for a while because it just makes no sense. I mean, the history is good. You can understand the history. You can follow the chronology and the battles and all that, and you know what happened, but the why did it happen is there really is no good answer to that. And for example, if you, let's say in June of 1914, early June 1914, when tensions were high, if you had sat down with the crown heads of Europe, Franz Joseph, Emperor of the Austro-Hungarian Empire, and Kaiser Wilhelm II, Emperor of the German Empire, and Tsar Nicholas, Emperor of the Russian Empire, and the Sultan in in Istanbul, Constantinople, the Ottoman Empire. So sat down with all the crown heads of Europe and said, hey, I've got a good idea. Why don't we start a war that will kill 20 million people, cause all four of your empires to collapse, put every one of you either in a grave or in exile the next 5 years, bankrupt France, bankrupt England, and destroy Europe as a world power? Who thinks that's a good idea? I don't think you would have had very many takers. And yet that is exactly what happened. The war started, 20 million were killed for no real discernible reason. All four of those empires collapsed. All four of those emperors were dead or in exile in a matter of years. And European power has never been the same. And so it shows that there was no strategic calculation. There was no foresight. There was no real understanding of what they were doing. They just got caught up in an escalatory dynamic. Everybody thought the war would be short. Everybody thought they would win, et cetera. And none of that turned out to be true. Same thing with the Iraq War in 2003. I mean, you look at Saddam Hussein, all he had to do was let the weapons inspectors in. Now, he didn't have weapons of mass destruction. He had in the past. He definitely had. This is not debatable. I mean, it's all very well established. He did have a nuclear weapons program. He did have chemical and biological weapons programs. He actually used those chemical weapons. It's all very well documented, but he had given them up. By the time 2003 came around, that was, his WMD was one of the famous reasons for invading Iraq. Turned out he didn't have those, at least. There's some question, by the way, about whether he had stockpiles of chemical and biological weapons and whether those were moved across the border into Syria, literally in the weeks and months before the U.S. invasion, whether perhaps some of those weapons are the very ones being used by Syria today. That's one I haven't been able to get good answers to. I've spoken to people with, top secret beyond security clearances, trying to probe that a little bit, and you don't get a straight answer, which tells me that maybe it's true, but I can't prove that. It doesn't matter. The point is, by the time we got to Iraq, those weapons were gone, and the evidence was clear that he had given up his nuclear ambitions in the early 90s. So there were no WMD in Iraq. That's just a fact. And so the question is, well, if you didn't have any WMD, and remember Bush 43 said, if you let the weapons inspectors in, we won't go to war. And he didn't, and we did go to war, and he ended up hanged after hiding and fighting and hiding and being captured and put on trial. He ended up hanged. And so you say, well, gee, why didn't he just let the inspectors in? That would have put an end to it. Well, the answer was he didn't believe us. He thought Bush was bluffing. He said, hey, you guys will never be dumb enough to come in here. And besides, I'm your checkmate against the Iraqis. And he wanted to pretend he had WMD so the Iraqis wouldn't mess with him. But he just got it wrong. I actually spoke to the guy, one of the few people who interrogated Saddam Hussein. So there was a period after Saddam was captured, before he was hanged, when he was a prisoner and available for interrogation. I spoke to one of his interrogators, and that's what I was told, that he just miscalculated. So the point is, really bad things happen, not because anyone thinks it's a good idea, but because they just miscalculate. So let's take that historical background, bring it over to Korea. Are we witnessing a series of possibly tragic miscalculations? And I think the answer is yes. So let's start with Kim Jong-un, the leader of North Korea. Now, let's distinguish for the listeners between a nuclear device and a nuclear weapon. A nuclear device is when I take fissile material, I create a controlled chain reaction, I have some detonators, I let it explode, and I get an atomic explosion. And you can detect those with seismographs and intelligence sources and other technical means. Well, there's no doubt that North Korea has that. They've detonated a number of these nuclear explosions. They have highly enriched uranium. They have plutonium, which is fissile material. You can make a atomic bomb out of either HEU, highly enriched uranium, or plutonium. They have estimated enough for 10 weapons. So they've mastered the enrichment cycle. They've got the fissile material. They've shown they can blow it up. And they have, as I said, they have detonated these atomic weapons. That's all pretty bad, but the next step is, can you weaponize it? Can you take that fissile material and put it in the form of a weapon that, furthermore, could be put on a warhead, on a missile? Because these devices, as I call them, they're the size of trucks. Now, I guess you could put it on a truck and drive it around, but where are you going to go with that? They can't. So they've got to weaponize it. You've got to do something else, which is you've got to ruggedize it. Ruggedize means, okay, even if I've got something that's a weapon that will work, that will detonate in a warhead, I've got to shoot it into space. You've got enormous stress during the liftoff phase. Then it goes into space. Then it has to re-enter the atmosphere. Then it's got to have heat shields. So it has a very rough ride before it reaches the target. So you've got to weaponize it and ruggedize it. The evidence is that North Korea is very far along in that. I won't say they've mastered it, but they put some models on display, and experts have looked at them and said, yeah, it looks like they know what they're doing. Who knows exactly where that is, but no reason to think that they're not pretty far along that. Now, the other thing you need, of course, is a missile that can reach a target. They've got fairly reliable short-range missiles. The next step up is the intermediate-range missile, something that will go out maybe 500 to 1,000 kilometers, that would be capable of reaching all of Japan, parts of China, and basically South Korea. Certainly, they can get those with short-range missiles. That's been hit or miss, no pun intended, but they do seem to have pretty much mastered that technology. They still have times when it blows up in the launch pad, or it launches, but then it sort of goes off course and lands who knows where. Not clear how much of that is imperfect technology on that part and how much might be sabotage on our part. Let's hope it's the latter. Let's hope it's both, actually. But they seem pretty far along in the intermediate range missile capability. The last leg of that triad is the intercontinental ballistic missile. This is the one that could hit Los Angeles, or actually hit a lot of big cities in the United States. It's much longer range. It's got to go into space and come back again. It doesn't go into orbit. It's kind of a suborbital ballistic path, but it's very long range. They have not mastered that. They're trying. They're making good progress. So where do we stand? They've got the enrichment cycle. They've got the fissile material. They've got the ability to create atomic explosions. They've got short-range and intermediate-range missiles. They're working on miniaturization, weaponization, ruggedization, and they're working on ICBMs. They're not that far away. They seem to be making very good progress. They are probably 4 years at most, maybe 3 years from being able to fire an atomic weapon at Los Angeles and kill 3 or 4 million Americans. So that's the capability. You know, whenever you do the strategic analysis, Alex, as you know, you have to look at capabilities and intentions. If you don't have the capability, then all the talk in the world doesn't mean anything because you can't do it. If you do have the capability, you still have to ask about intentions. You know, India has nuclear weapons capability, missile capability, but do they intend to strike the United States? Nobody thinks that. So it's the combination of the two, capability and intentions. They've come very far down the capabilities path. They're getting dangerously close to being able to nuke LA. So let's talk about intentions. Kim Jong-un has stated his intention to attack the U.S. with nuclear weapons. I see no reason not to believe him. He doesn't quite have the capability yet, but that's a dangerous combination. Now, what is he thinking? Well, of course, it's impossible to know. And one line of analysis I've read recently, which is not reassuring, is that he's actually crazy. That's probably the worst possibility in the world. You got a crazy guy with nukes. But even if he's one of these people who's very, let's say, cagey, not crazy, but acts a little crazy to keep everybody off guard, something called, strategic ambiguity. Go back to the World War I case history. It's the confusion about other people's intentions that causes strategic miscalculation. Now, he's looking around the world and he's saying a couple things. Let's look at different nuclear weapons programs in rogue states. So what happened in Iraq? Iraq was working on nuclear weapons. They didn't have them when we went in, but they were working on them. The evidence for that is clear. Iraq was working on nuclear weapons programs. They gave it up, and Saddam Hussein got hanged. Gaddafi in Libya was working on a nuclear weapons program. He gave it up, and he got a bullet in the eye. So the lesson is, if you have nukes and you give them up, you get killed. The Iranians are working on nuclear weapons programs, and they're still standing. So Kim Jong-un's takeaway is, okay, if you work with the United States and give up your nukes, you get killed. But if you keep your nukes, they don't mess with you. So, which is totally a bad message. It's a major blunder of U.S. foreign policy and U.S. military policy that we have created a situation in 3 cases, Iraq, Libya, and Iran, where if you work with us and give up your nukes, you get killed. But if you keep them, we don't mess with you. That's the wrong message. But that's the message we sent, and that's what Kim Jong-un has internalized. So he's saying, all right, well, I'm going to keep going on my program because, look, it's an illegitimate regime. It's a brutal regime. It's a thuggish regime. It's run like a crime family. I've done a lot of work on North Korea. They actually sent a cable to their embassies saying, all you embassies said, we don't have the money to pay for you, so you have to pay your own bills. And we suggest you do it with criminal rackets. I mean, counterfeiting, drug smuggling, and diplomatic pouches. I mean, it's run like the mafia. And they've got the same ethic of the mafia, which is basically kill anyone who looks at you cross-eyed. So, including your own family members. So that's what's going on there. That's the best way to understand it. So Kim Jong-un, one lesson is keep going with the nuke program because the U.S. won't mess with you. So, and if he actually perfects it, meaning has reliable ICBM technology, miniaturization, all the things we just talked about, you definitely won't mess with me, because if you do and you don't disable the whole program, I will send a nuclear missile to Los Angeles and kill millions of Americans. So good luck with that. So that's the first thing he's thinking. The second thing he's thinking is again, being illegitimate, how do you keep this thing going? How do you keep any racket going? Well, the main way you keep the racket going is to pay your people. Well, how does he earn hard currency? He's been shut out of the banking system. He's been de-SWIFted. Just a quick footnote on that. SWIFT is is basically the central nervous system of the international banking system. It's a message traffic system run in Brussels, and this is where all the big banks in the world exchange money. And when Deutsche Bank is sending $1 billion to Citibank, it goes through SWIFT. When someone's exporting an oil tanker and is waiting to get paid, however many hundred millions of dollars for the cargo, that goes through SWIFT, whether it's dollars, euros, Swiss francs, yen, etc. All that message traffic goes through SWIFT. Well, in 2012, during what I call the first Iran-U.S. financial war, we worked with our allies to what we call de-SWIFT Iran, basically kick them off the SWIFT payment system. So you can ship all the oil you want, but you can't get paid. So North Korea, needless to say, is the second country to be de-SWIFted. It's a pretty extreme remedy. It's like cutting off oxygen to a patient in an intensive care unit. They're probably going to, suffocate. And that's what's happened to them. Now, there are ways around that. You can use front banks. So if a Chinese bank is willing to send message traffic, wire transfers, basically, on behalf of North Korea without disclosing the beneficial party. You're supposed to do that, by the way. There are these forms, MT 201s and so forth, where you put you put the sender, the recipient, the account information, the amount, the currency, all that stuff. But there's a line at the bottom for beneficial holder, which is if you're acting as agent for somebody else, just leave it blank. That's one kind of fraud. But the Chinese might leave those blank for North Korea. And by the way, the Russians. And I just learned the other day the Malaysians have been doing something similar. Anyway, be that as it may, the U.S. obviously knows this as part of our intelligence gathering. So what we're saying, just to dial it up, going back to your escalatory dynamic, we're saying to the Chinese banks, hey, if you front for North Korea, we're going to kick you out of the U.S. payment system. That's a big deal because these Chinese banks obviously need access to the dollar payment system. So that's really putting the screws in North Korea. I'm sure that's what was discussed in part between President Trump and President Xi at the Mar-a-Lago summit a few days ago, which is, behind closed doors, which is we're about to get serious and we will put pressure on you directly if you don't help us. And then Trump's been tweeting about this. So leaves out the details. You can only do so much on Twitter, but it's pretty clear what's going on. Now, so we're putting pressure on North Korea. Now here's where the strategic miscalculation comes in. Oh, by the way, we just want one more aside. So the way North Korea gets the money to pay their people is by selling weapons to Iran. Going back to the Iran portfolio, the North Korean scientists are further along than the Iranian scientists. Iranians have got the enrichment cycle down. They're under a lot of scrutiny. Their missile program is coming along. But all these technological items I mentioned, weaponization, ruggedization, miniaturization, ICBMs, the North Koreans seem to be further along than the Iranians. So the North Koreans are selling that technology to the Iranians. That's a separate story. Save that for another day. But they're getting paid in gold. This is why there's very strong physical demand for gold. There's something that has emerged. I've written about this for one of the think tanks in Washington. I call it the axis of gold. And it's basically Iran, China, Russia, and Turkey, and I would include North Korea as a sort of auxiliary member. The story of Russia and China acquiring gold as an alternative to the dollar to build up their reserves as insurance against inflation, all the reasons that any investor might want gold, which all apply. That is a big story. We've talked about that a lot in the past. But there's another reason, which is to avoid sanctions, avoid interdiction. As you know, with gold, it's not physical gold we're talking about. It's not digital. You can't hack it. You can't erase it. You can't interdict it. It doesn't go through SWIFT. You just take the bars, put them on a plane, fly them to Shanghai or Pyongyang or Moscow or Tehran, wherever they happen to be going. And you need very good intelligence to know where it is. And then, even then, are you going to shoot down a plane? Probably not. So that gold gets around. So that's how these guys are paying each other outside the message traffic system that is de facto controlled by the United States. So there's a big demand for gold coming from that vector. So North Korea is getting gold And then you can use that to bribe people and pay them off, or use it to buy other things, use it to buy imports. They're like luxury goods. These guys, I say these guys, I mean, North Korean military leaders and intelligence assets, and the people the leadership, the people that Kim Jong-un has to keep happy, they like their fancy watches and fancy cars as much as anybody, and you can import that stuff with gold. So there's a gold trade going on there. So Kim Jong-un's got two big reasons to keep his program going. One, he believes that if he perfects it, the U.S. won't mess with him and he can perpetuate his regime. Two, he can sell the technology for gold and keep his people happy and protect his regime. So he's like the godfather sitting up there. Here's the problem. The United States is not going to allow him to nuke Los Angeles. Mm-hmm. He might say, I just want the capability because you guys won't mess with me. But the answer is no, you're not going to get the capability. You can't gamble with Los Angeles. You can't even take a 1% gamble with Los Angeles. You can't take a fraction of 1%. This was something that Dick Cheney called the 1% doctrine, which meant that even when the risks are existential, you can't take even a minute fraction of 1%. You can't make that bet. You have to eliminate it. Mm-hmm. So Kim Jong-un is on a course to get the weapons. The U.S. is on a course to prevent him from getting the weapons. Each side misreads the intentions of the other. Now, here's where it gets really interesting, where I think war could be imminent. How do you actually root out this program? Well, there's an old saying, if you shoot the king, don't miss. Meaning, if you try to assassinate a leader, shoot the king, in other words, and you miss, you're dead. They're going to come back to you. This is what happened with Hitler, with the Wolf Slayer plot, when they actually got a briefcase bomb, 2 inches from Hitler, and it blew up. But the briefcase had been moved behind an oak panel at the last minute, and Hitler was injured and wounded but not killed. And then, of course, that was bad news for all the perpetrators because they all got killed. So if you shoot the king, don't miss. So if we, the United States, are going to take out the North Korean nuclear program, we've got to get it all. We can't leave them with any fissile material. We can't leave them with any missile launch capability. We can't leave them with any reactors, et cetera, because they'll just come back and get us. And there are a lot of ways to do it. I've been talking about the ICBM in Los Angeles as the existential threat, but they could unleash a military barrage on Seoul, Korea. I've been to Seoul a number of times. It's very close to the North Korean border. Mm-hmm. It'd be nicer for them if they were down around Busan or someplace further away, but they're not. They're well within artillery range. I'm not talking about bomber range. I'm talking about artillery range of the North Korean border, and they will be massively bombarded. And then North Korea could use their short-range missiles to attack U.S. bases in Korea and the region. So even if they can't reach L.A. because we hit them before they get the ICBM, they can easily kill a lot of Americans in the region, and that's exactly what they've threatened to do. And there they do have the capability. So if we hit them, we've got to take out everything, or else the retaliation on us and the South Koreans and probably the Japanese and others will be pretty horrendous. So if you shoot the king, don't miss. So what does it mean when I say don't miss? Well, this stuff, the North Korean stuff is underground. It's buried. It's in mountains. It's heavily fortified. We do have these GBUs, these bunker buster bombs, and we've been working on that. But you might, if we give them more time and let them burrow in deeply and dig more tunnels, we might have to use tactical nuclear weapons. Now, atomic weapons, but I'm switching back and forth between atomic weapons and nuclear weapons, just trying to distinguish between Hiroshima-type bombs and thermonuclear devices, which are North Korea's not even close to getting those, but they're the ones that the Russia and the United States have. But we're talking about atomic weapons, the kind that were used in Hiroshima and Nagasaki. Now, that was the last time, August 1945 was the last and only time these weapons were used in warfare, other than, obviously, they've been tested up until the 1960s. But there's smaller yield tactical nuclear weapons. There are actually some what they call subnuclear, which are pretty powerful, that kind of, get up to a certain critical stage and unleash a lot of energy. I don't want to get too technical on all this, but the point being, those are obviously more powerful than the bunker busters. Mm-hmm. Will we have to use those to wipe out the North Korean program. In other words, make sure if we shoot, we don't miss. Well, all I know is the more time that goes on, the more likely that becomes. So if you're the United States and you're saying, well, we don't want to use tactical nuclear weapons because that crosses a separate red line, do we then give permission to Russia to use them elsewhere? Then you better act sooner than later. So here's the dynamic. Kim Jong-un is on a course where he says, I'm keeping my nuclear weapons to perpetuate my regime and so the U.S. won't mess with me. The U.S. is on a course that says, we've got to take out your program sooner than later because it's an existential threat. That's a recipe for war. And that's a recipe for war sooner than later. So my view is we're on that course. This is not just saber rattling. This is not just bluster. This is not just talk. And Trump, now just to connect the dots all the way back to Syria, Trump has shown that he's decisive, that he is willing to shoot. And not to be glib, but the whole thing in Syria, I mean, when you have a forward deployed military with as much weaponry and technology and capability as the United States, the generals don't totally mind taking out a Syrian airfield. I mean, in some ways, it's target practice. And again, I'm not being glib. I'm just saying that when you got all this stuff, you got to use it every now and then to make sure it works. And you know that very well. So the military's primed. They had a nice, live fire exercise in Syria. Trump has shown he's decisive. We're on a collision course with North Korea. So, again, just to cut to the chase, this is one of the drivers of gold right now, physical gold prices in particular, in addition to the other things we mentioned. I think the gold market has this figured out. I think the smart money has this figured out. Institutional investors are usually the last to know, and retail, unfortunately. But I think some of the hedge funds, some of the sovereign wealth funds, some of the big players are going to gold because they see this happening.
Okay, so this has brought up a couple of different thoughts that I think maybe we should talk a little more about. And one is, you had mentioned that kicking China out of SWIFT is a potential move on the chessboard. This seems to me to be a pretty extreme sort of action, and what I'm wondering about that is, could that backfire, and could the blowback of that be cause for an acceleration of seeking alternatives to SWIFT? In other words, looking for other ways to transfer money around, or looking at gold as being, as you've mentioned, the axis of gold. Gold is sort of a two-edged sword here, in that it's the only form of money I'm aware of, really, that governments are unable to control. Gold is completely fungible. You can take a gold bar, and even though it's got serial numbers on it, and it may be tracked in certain systems, if you take it out of those systems and you melt it, you could recast it into a bar and sell it anywhere in the world, and it's completely untraceable. What do you see there as could that be an accelerant to moving away from the U.S. dollar as the form of transaction globally?
Yeah, just to be clear, Alex, I don't foresee kicking China out of SWIFT. I think that's the equivalent of using tactical nuclear weapons. I don't think that will happen. What I would, just to be more specific, what I was talking about is the United States kicking certain Chinese banks out of Fedwire, which is the U.S. dollar payment system. So there are two major payment systems. One is the U.S. dollar payment system, completely controlled by the Fed and the U.S. Treasury, operating through Fedwire. And even if you're a smaller bank or a foreign bank and you're not in Fedwire, you can't move dollars around without going through a correspondent bank that does. And so what the U.S. does is we just send out, through whether it's through OFAC or other sources, we just tell our banks, hey, this bank is on the list. This Chinese bank is on the list because we think they're funding for North Korea. All the banks in the world are not allowed to move dollars through our system for that bank. So it's kind of like Syria. It's targeted. By the way, we're morphing. It's interesting, Alex. You have a military background. I do a lot of strategic work. We both obviously have a financial background. Notice how we're moving back and forth between kinetic war and financial war. These are not just metaphors. I just led a seminar. It was really an honor to be invited for the Advanced Strategic Art program at the U.S. Army War College. And this was a group of, I say college, don't think of undergraduates running around in blue jeans. These are the U.S. Army War College has graduate level instruction only. There is no undergraduate division. The people in my seminar, about 15 of them, were mid-career officers. So, majors, captains, lieutenant colonels, all with brilliant academic backgrounds. These are, and this was a hand-picked group. The quality of the students at the U.S. Army War College is pretty high to begin with. This was a select group of people who have been identified for their potential as strategic thought leaders. So these will be the future, future generals. These are officers who will end up in the National Security Council, cabinet level or under secretary level positions, NSA, et cetera. So really the creme de la creme of strategic thinkers. I was invited in to do a financial warfighting seminar. And we had it at the historic. We held at the historic 69th Regiment Armory in New York. There, the U.S. Army War College is in Carlisle, Pennsylvania. But this group came to New York because they were meeting with other financial people. Actually, after my lecture, their next guest lecturer was Secretary Geithner. So we had a little fun talking about that. I said, well, you're going to get a very different view of the world from Secretary Geithner than you got from me, but that's okay. That kind of diversity is good. But this is exactly what we were talking about, how the line between kinetic and financial and cyber and financial are being blurred. They're all part of the battle space. So just to come back to this, just as we targeted one airfield, not 6 in Syria, so the U.S. can target one bank, not 20, and one payment system, not all of them. So I don't see China as a country will not be de-SWIFted, but certain Chinese banks may be kicked out of the U.S. payment system if they're carrying water for North Korea. So I do expect that. Now, having said that, your bigger point is absolutely correct, that this has been well vetted. Russia and China are building up their gold reserves, starting to do business in each other's currency. So if Russia ships energy to China, they're willing to get paid in yuan. If Russia then wants to buy certain technology exports, or it could be iPhones for that matter, from China, China's willing to take the yuan back. China's willing to take rubles, et cetera. So they're already kind of getting away from the dollar, but they're also building payment systems. And actually, one of my favorite central bankers in the world, Elvira Nabiulina, who's the head of the Central Bank of Russia, recently announced that if Russia were de-SWIFted, they would kind of shrug and say, "No big deal. We've got our alternatives good to go." So I don't see Russia trying to get de-SWIFted, but they are. One of these alternatives, as I mentioned, is gold. All of a sudden, your reserve position might be, in Russia's case, it's today it's about 400 billion. China's in a whole different league there. China's about $3 trillion of reserves. I'm using dollars as a numeraire, but it's not all in dollars. That's the point. Some of it's in euros, some of it's in each other's currencies, and increasing amounts are in gold. So just take Russia. If your reserve position is 400 billion, you don't spend your whole $400 billion all at once. It's, 5 billion here, 10 billion there, a billion here, a couple $100 million there, as the case may be, to settle payments and payment obligations with trading partners, or if your own corporations need access to hard currency. Well, gold's a part of that. You can, like you say, Russia owes some money to China, put some gold bars on a plane, fly to Shanghai, done. And I was recently in Shanghai. I met with the 2 of the 5 biggest physical gold dealers in China. They're banks, of course. By the way, one of the things I asked them, I said, I had pretty good information that the People's Liberation Army moves the gold around, in armored columns and so forth. I said, why is that? I said, why don't you guys move the gold around? I mean, can't you get some armored cars or Brinks or whatever? And the guy just looked at me and said, we're not allowed to have guns. I said, oh, well, right. You don't have a Second Amendment. In the U.S., you're allowed to have guns, but you can't very well be in the business of having an armored car business if you can't have guns. And so that's one reason. There are multiple reasons, but that's one reason they use the PLA, because they're the only people allowed to have weapons. But the government, the PLA, the banks, they're all working hand in glove. But this system is very far along. So again, from the gold investor's point of view, rising geopolitical tensions is one reason to have physical gold. But the efforts of Russia and China and others to build alternatives to the dollar payment system. I mean, look, The euro's got its issues, and even if you switch from dollars to euros and Swiss francs, which is what Iran did when we kicked Iran out of the dollar payment system in 2012, they said no big deal. They just switched to euros. We'll ship the oil, pay us in euros, pay us in Swiss francs. It was only when they were de-swifted, when they couldn't transact in euros and Swiss francs and yen and other hard currencies, that they actually came to the bargaining table and started talking to Obama about their nuclear program. So, but Russia and China aren't going to wait for that. They're not going to be vulnerable to that. They're not going to be held hostage. And so, in addition to all the other reasons we mentioned, this is a very strong demand vector for gold, which is it's the one thing you can't freeze, seize, or interdict.
Mm-hmm. Going back to something we were talking about a little bit earlier, you had mentioned reading about World War I and the reasons that countries go to war. And it made me think of how you also mentioned Kim Jong-un. He sort of acts a little crazy sometimes, and, it's possible that instead of being crazy, I should say, he's just acting this way to keep people off guard. And it occurs to me, and this is complete speculation and opinion on my part, but it occurs to me that I think Trump maybe does a little bit of the same thing. And so if that's true, what we have here is two individuals who sort of act a little crazy, but at the end of the day, they're playing it with very serious stakes at hand, and both of them, to some degree or another, have a need to prove that what they're saying is the truth and they should be taken seriously. So that seems to me to be a pretty volatile mixture. What do you think about that?
I agree completely. It's volatile and unpredictable. I wouldn't draw the parallel, meaning Trump's pretty smart in my view. He's not crazy, and when we say he acts crazy, what we really mean is that he acts in an unpredictable way. Mm-hmm. So that's that can be a good thing. Keep your opponents and adversaries off guard. People never know what's coming. Forces them to pay attention. Forces them to listen to you. So I would describe Trump as situational, mercurial. He's certainly shown an ability to just do a 180 and not look back. I mean, no better example than Chinese currency manipulation. Remember during the campaign, China is a currency manipulator. They're stealing our jobs. And when I'm president on day one, I'm signing an executive order declaring China a currency manipulator. Well, bearing in mind that that's not the president's job. That actually comes from the Treasury Department. The Treasury Department can take instructions from the White House if need be. And it's twice a year that currency manipulator label comes out in a report, required by Congress twice a year, April and October. By the way, the April report is coming out in a matter of days. And the best information there is that China will not be declared a currency manipulator. Nor did the president do anything on his first day in office, nor has he mentioned it very much recently. So there's, and the reason is obvious, which is he's now engaged in dialogue with China. He needs China's help on North Korea. By the way, you mentioned the deployment of the aircraft carrier strike group to Korean waters, very big deal. The best information, not verified from multiple sources, but from at least one reliable source, is that China has mobilized the People's Liberation Army to move them to the Yalu River, just on the Chinese side of the North Korean border. That, of course, has echoes of the Korean War, when General MacArthur miscalculated Chinese intentions with regard to crossing the Yalu. But whether this is a pincer movement where you have ground troops on the Yalu River and sea forces in the North Korean waters, in Korean waters, ready to strike on land, sea, and air if Kim Jong-un doesn't back off, that's possible. Very interesting scenario where the last time we mixed it up in Korea, it was the U.S. and South Koreans versus China and the North Koreans. The next time it could be South Koreans, U.S. and China versus the North Koreans. That would be an interesting twist. But that's only one possibility. Another possibility is that China is kind of signaling the U.S., "Hey, don't attack North Korea because we're sitting there on the border. We're waiting to we'll come back into Korea and stabilize rather than destabilize the regime." I think it's probably the former than the latter, but you just can't. rule anything out. All I know is that you've got dangerous escalation going on land, sea, and air, U.S. and China, putting, kind of boxing North Korea from a couple different directions. But again, this is all about these potential miscalculations. So I think Trump knows what he's doing. He does. He has reverse course. That's a way to understand Trump. Not as crazy, but as I say, situational, mercurial, a little unpredictable. Kim Jong-un, on the other hand, whenever you have to say to yourself, "Gee, is the guy actually crazy, or is he just acting crazy?" Listen to your own question. I mean, what's the difference? What's the difference between a guy who is crazy and a guy who acts crazy? The fact is, some crazy people act pretty sane, like serial killers and others. So I don't know. But here's what I do know. You cannot gamble Los Angeles on getting the right answer to that question. You have to basically treat him as perfectly capable and having the intent to start World War III, and you have to stop that before it happens.
All right. Let's turn to economics as we wrap this up then. The next FOMC meeting is scheduled for 3 weeks from now. What track is the Fed on in terms of raising interest rates, and what are the factors we need to be watching that could impact this process?
Well, we have just a couple of minutes left, and that's something I could probably talk for an hour on without pausing for breath. So we don't have time for that. But so here's the thing, Alex. I'll give you the short version, and but this is the Fed policy is the gift that keeps giving. I mean, there's never a time when we run out of things to say on the Fed. So maybe we'll make that a big topic in the next podcast. But here's the quick version. The Fed will raise rates 4 times a year, 25 basis points each, in March, June, September, December, every year from now until the middle of 2019, until they get to 3.25%. That's the baseline scenario. That's what they're going to do. Now, there are 3 reasons why they won't actually do it in a particular case. So just assume they're going to raise them in June, September, December 2017. March of 2008, they're just going to keep going unless one of 3 things causes them to pause. And pause is the key word. That's the word Dudley used the other day. And it's not by accident. Pause is one of those buzzwords. Pause means we don't raise at a particular meeting. And we might pause for 1 meeting. We might pause for 2 meetings. And by the way, in 2016, they paused for 7 meetings. They raised them in December 2015. They did not raise them again until December 2016. There are 8 meetings per year. So that was a 7-meeting pause. So these pauses can be pretty long. But pause just means one of 3 things has happened, and we're going to stop raising rates until the situation is rectified. So what are the triggers for a pause? One is if job creation falls below 75,000. So even 100,000, which these days is considered a weak jobs report, that will not cause the Fed to pause. So if you don't see that, then they're still going to raise. Second one is disinflation. The Fed believes it has achieved its inflation targets, or will shortly. Their preferred measure is PCE, price deflator, core year over year. That's right now about 1.8%. Their target is 2%. So they're just about there. But if you see that back off, if you see it go down to 1.5, 1.3, et cetera, then that's another reason for them to pause. The third reason is stock market falls out of bed. Anything short of a 5% drawdown, they don't care. So if the stock market Dow goes down 1,000 points, the Fed absolutely doesn't care. But if it goes down more than 1,000 points, if it starts getting closer to 10%, if it looks disorderly, meaning it could just feed on itself and create a panic momentum, then they will pause. But that's it. So look for those. And kind of going along with the job point I mentioned, if GDP goes, completely falls out of bed, goes negative. By the way, we're close to negative right now. Forecast for first quarter looks like it's maybe 0.6%, or certainly below 1%. So if you see job creation below 75,000 or GDP, going negative, if you see a disorderly route in the stock market of between 5 and 10% heading south, or if you see disinflation where PCE, core deflator year over year, starts going down significantly back down to the 1.5% area, or certainly any 2 of those, then the Fed will pause. If you don't see those things, and right now I don't, right now those things are not happening, then the Fed will raise. So I've got them raising rates in June. And, I'll take September one step at a time. But if those things don't happen, then they would raise in September. But here's the problem. The Fed is raising rates for the wrong reason. The Fed historically, there is a high correlation between Fed rate hikes and an expanding economy. Well, that makes sense, right? The Fed sits there, they watch the economy grows, unemployment goes down, labor markets get tight, inflation picks up, the whole thing's getting a little hot, the Fed thinks they got to cool it down, so they raise rates, and then same thing in reverse, they raise them too far, the economy cools down, unemployment goes up, inflation cools down, and they go, oh, gee, we better cut rates. That's a normal business cycle. The Fed does not lead the business cycle, they follow it. They raise rates when the economy's hot, and they cut rates when the economy's cool. Pretty simple. That is not what's going on right now. The market thinks it is, which is one of the reasons the stock market's going crazy, but that is not what's going on. What's going on is the Fed is raising rates exactly as I described because they're playing catch up, because they failed to raise rates in 2010, 11, and 12 when they should have. In other words, Bernanke skipped a whole rate hike cycle in the early 2010s. Because he was doing all these nutty experiments with QE and ZIRP, zero interest rate policy. And now the Fed has got to catch up. Why? Because you've got to cut rates to get out of a recession. We could be in a recession any time. How do you cut rates, 3% if they're only 1%? Well, the answer is you can't. You got to get them up to 3% or 3.25%, so you can cut them again to get out of a recession. So the Fed's doing this very strange finesse where they're raising rates not into strength, but into weakness. And they're raising rates to prepare to cure a future recession without causing the recession they're trying to cure. Mm-hmm. That's a finesse. I don't think they're going to do it. They are going to try. I don't think they're going to pull it off. I think they're actually going to cause a recession. So we talked about Trump flip-flops. The Fed could flip-flop as early as this summer. So I do look for the June rate hike, but by then it could very well be the case that they've thrown the U.S. economy into a recession. You do see one of these factors I mentioned, and that they do have to pause by September. But let's take that one step at a time. By the way, the pause is bullish for gold because it's a monetary easing. Mm-hmm. But even the rate hikes don't seem to have stopped gold, because of the geopolitical factors we mentioned. Also, these are nominal rate hikes. Gold investors need to focus on real rate hikes. And as long as inflation is ticking up, then the real rate's actually going down, even as the nominal rate goes up. So we'll leave it there. But I know that's a lot to unpack. But listeners can always play the tape back and hear it twice. So I hope that's helpful.
I'm sure it will be. Jim, we've covered a lot of ground here on today's podcast. This has been a great discussion. I've enjoyed it a lot. I want to thank you, as always, for your time and for your insight. Appreciate it, and look forward to getting together with you again next month.
Thanks, Alex.
You have been listening to The Gold Chronicles with Jim Rickards and Alex Stanzik, presented by Physical Gold Fund. Recordings can be found